Hello. In this session, we will see how to secure your APIs using JWT token. In the end of session, we will have two endpoints, register and login. Register we will use to create new user in our database, and login we will use to generate JWT token. However, register will also return JWT token after creating new user in database. This is not an ideal way or modern way to handle the authentication, but this is good to start with. In modern application, to make it more secure, we should not handle user authentication in our own database. Instead, we can use various frameworks or cloud authentication providers like Azure AD B2C or OAuth 0. We may improve our application in future for this, but for now, let us do it ourselves. So let us start with our domain layer. We have this entity base class. We need to make few changes to this class. Let us add one property created by, so that whenever we will create any entity in database, we will be saving user ID of the person who created that entity. Next, I would also like to do one small refactoring here, not directly related to our session today. Instead of error messages, let us make it domain error messages. The next thing we will need is user entity. Right now we have only story domain folder in our project. So let us add account domain. In that, let us add entity user. And this entity will look like this. It has properties like first name, last name, email, phone, and property to store hashed password. It has private constructor so that we can't create object of user directly. And it has one factory method which will be responsible to create object of user. Next change in our entity we will need in our story entity. As now, whenever user will create the story, we want to save ID of that user also. So let us make small change over here. In create method, we are adding a parameter created by, where we will pass user ID of the user who is creating this story. And so we are assigning it to created by property. These are few things that we will need in our domain layer. Now let us move to our application layer. Inside account app layer, create folder constants. Inside that, create class validation constants. Validation constants class will have various constants that we will need to validate our request object. For example, we don't want to allow more than 30 characters in name or more than 30 characters in email. Maximum country code length should be 7. Max phone length should be 10. Minimum password length is 5 and maximum password length is 20. So these are few constants that we will need. Then let us add another class, validation messages. These are few typical validation messages that we need while registering the user. Email already exists and invalid credentials. Then let us create one folder to add interfaces. We will need interface IAuth utility. So these are few typical methods that we need during authentication process. When we will register new user, we want to hash password. Then we will definitely need a method to generate the token and the method to verify the password. So verify password will take your password and hash which is stored in database, and it will return true if this matches, false if it doesn't. Then we will need user repository interface. So let us add iUser repository. It will have methods register user, get user by ID and get user by email. After doing this groundwork, now we are ready to add use cases. So let us go to use cases folder. We already have get user by ID, which has some dummy implementation. Now we can modify it to have actual implementation. First of all, in request object, you need to change data type of ID as get. Then let us modify response object. Right now it has only two properties. Let us add all the properties that we will need and also the constructor. Now let us modify the handler class. Handler class should look like this. Now instead of returning dummy data, we will be fetching data from user repository. So we are adding that dependency here. Then we will get that particular user by ID from the repository. Once user is fetched in the entity, we are passing that entity to the constructor of get user by ID response class, so that it will create object of get user by ID response class, so that our handler will look clean. Now let us add use case to register the new user. So create folder register user. In that we will need class register user command. So this is our request class, which will take first name, last name, email, country code, phone and password. And we will need register user response class as well. So in response, we will be returning user ID, first name, last name, email, phone and access token. This is a constructor which will be responsible to create response object using user entity and access token. Then we will need handler class. So let us add register user command handler. Register user command handler will use user repository as well auth utility. So before proceeding with registration of new user, we need to check if that email ID already exists. Then we will throw invalid request exception with error message, email already exists. Now this is complaining. So let us make some change here. We will need one constructor overload, which will take string and then convert it to list and will assign it to the errors. If user doesn't exist in database, then we can proceed. Using auth utility, we need to hash the password. Then we can create user entity object using create factory method. We can pass this user object to register user method of user repository, which will be responsible to store it to the database, and it will return us the newly created user. This user we want to pass as a response, but in addition to user data, we also want to pass access token in a response. So we will be using auth utility to generate token. Generate token will need some user information. That's why we are passing user object to it, and it will give us access token. And then using this new user entity and access token, we will be creating response object, and then we will return this response object from the handler. So a lot of abstraction is here, like hash password, generate token, which is providing us this auth utility that we will look in shortly. Also in register user, one important thing that we will need is user request validation. So let us add register user command validator. Register user command validator will have rules to validate create user request. Password should not be empty, should have minimum length of 5, maximum length of 20, and must have upper digit and special character in it. So this is a custom rule that we are defining here. Next, we will need login use case. So let us add folder login. Let us add class login user command. While logging in, we just need email and password. Then we will need login user response. This will look exact same as register user response. It will return us ID, first name, last name, email, phone, and access token. Then we will need command validator class. Here we will validate that email should not be empty and it should be email address, and password should not be empty and should have maximum length of 20. Then we will need command handler. Our command handler will look like this. It will use user repository and authentication utility. First, we will get user by the ID which is provided in the request. If user is null, that means there is no record with that particular email ID, and we can throw exception invalid username or password. Let us make it or. But if user exists, then we need to check that the password that is provided in request matches with the hash password that is stored in database. For that, we are using auth utilities verify password method. If it doesn't match, then we will again throw the same exception invalid username or password. And if it matches, then we will generate the token using auth utility, and then we will create response object, and then we will return that response object. With this, I think we are done with the changes that are required in our application layer. I just noticed one mistake here. In account domain, we should have entities folder. So this is the structure we are following. And inside that entities folder, we should have user entity. And we should adjust the namespace accordingly. So our user entity should be in domain.account_domain.entities namespace. So this is small change we need to do in our domain layer. With this, we are done with our domain layer and application layer changes. Now let us go to our infrastructure layer. In infrastructure layer, there is Cosmos repository where we need to implement iUser repository. But before implementing iUser repository for Cosmos DB, just for sake of simplicity, we can implement it as an in-memory repository. And once everything is done, then we can modify it to connect with Cosmos DB. So let us add user repositories folder. Then add new class user repository. Here we need to implement iUser repository. So it has these three methods that we need to implement. So instead of connecting to Cosmos DB, first let us have one list and let us store that user in this list. Let us get user from this list and let us get user by ID from the same list. And then we will modify it to connect to Cosmos DB. Now we need to add this dependency. So as we are not using database and we are using list, so add it as a singleton. Insert required using statement. These are enough changes for our repository for now. Now in this infrastructure layer, if you will see, we have two projects, Cosmos repository, which communicates with Cosmos DB, and third-party services. Right now it has only Azure service which communicate with blob storage. Now we also want to add some utilities, like for authentication we are using iAuth utility interface. To implement that interface, we can have separate project. So in infrastructure, let us add new class library project. Make sure that you are saving it to infrastructure folder and then name it orion.utilities. We are using .NET 7.0. Remove this class 1 and add a class auth utility. Here you need to implement iAuth utility interface. So for that, first you need to add project reference to your Orion.application project, and then add using statement. We can remove unused using and then implement this interface. Again, to avoid complexity, for now we can return some dummy text. So this is simple dummy implementation of auth utility. We will modify it once our flow is complete. Next, we need to do dependency injection for this class. So let us add dependency injection. It will look like this. It has add utilities extension method, and here we are adding our auth utility class as a scoped lifetime. So I think with this we are done with infrastructure layer for now. We will definitely revisit it for actual implementation of auth utility and our iUser repository. Next, let us go to our web layer or API layer. Let us go to controller and add auth controller. Our auth controller should get derived from Orion base controller, which provides us some base functionality. Right now it has only mediator. Auth controller will have two actions, register and login. To register, we are passing register user command object as a request. So it will have all these details. While registering, we need to pass first name, last name, email, country code, phone and password. And this mediator.send will pass this command object to register user command handler. If request is valid and user doesn't exist, it will create the user and we will get that user response object, and then we are returning created at action 201 with this response and a location. Same thing with login. We are accepting email and password as a request, and then it will send it to login user command handler. If user exists and password matches with the hash, then we will get login response back, which will send back as a response 200 status code. Next, as we have added one new project to infrastructure layer, that is Orion.utilities. It has extension method to add dependency, add utilities. This method we need to call from program class, where we add all the services. It will be like builder.services.add utilities. For that, make sure that you first added the reference to Orion.utilities project in API project. Now let us first test these much changes. So let us run the project. It has some compilation error. We added created by field to our story entity. So we need to pass something here. For now, let us pass some GUID. Let us compile it. We need to modify our unit test also. Don't worry, these are temporary changes. We will revisit this. Now user ID we modified as GUID. So after making these changes, let us run it. And we have register and login endpoints. So let us test it. Password should contain some special character, numeric, capital letter and all. So let us modify our dummy code in our utilities. Instead of comparing it with password, we should have this password @123 so that it will be easier for us to test it. Now let us go to the Postman, try to create the user, and it is creating user for us, not in Cosmos DB, but in memory list, and it is also returning us access token. This is dummy one, by the way. Now let us test login endpoint. It is saying that invalid username or password because we registered using this email ID. So let us use same one. And now send. And we are logged in successfully. It is returning us a user data plus access token. Now let us implement our auth utility so that instead of dummy access token, we should get valid JWT token. Let us modify generate token. First, we need to install one NuGet package. So go to NuGet package manager, search for system identity model.tokens.jwt. Let us install this package. Also, we will do password hashing and verify password. For that purpose, we will be using another NuGet package, that is bcrypt.net next. So search for it and install the latest version. Once these two packages are installed, we are ready to implement all these three methods. Generate token method will look like this. We are first creating object of JWT security token handler. Then we have one key, which is a secret key, which we will be using to sign our JWT token. This is just dummy value. In real life application, you will have some complex string here, and definitely you are not going to write that key here. We will keep it in some secure place like key vault. Then we are creating object of security token descriptor. It has few properties like subject, expires, issuer, audience, and signing credentials. Subject is itself a object of claims identity, and claims identity is array of claims. For now, we are adding three claims: name identifier, subject, and email. Then we are setting expiry to 24 hours. Issuer is Orion API, audience is Orion API. These values can be moved to app settings.json file. Then we are creating signing credential object, and for that purpose we are using this key, which we are passing to symmetric security key object constructor. And to create this signing credentials, we are using HMAC SHA 256 signature. And then using this token handler class, we are creating the token. Next, we can implement hash password. To hash our password, we are using library bcrypt.net bcrypt. It has a hash password method. To it, we are just passing our password, string password, and it will take care of hashing it, and then we are returning the result. Next, to verify password, same library we can use. We just to call verify method of that library, and we need to pass string password that we got from in request and hash password which we will get from database, and it will compare it and will return us true or false. So with this, all these three methods are implemented. Now let us run and check what is the output. Now if we'll go to register and click on send button, now you can see that we are getting actual JWT. You can copy this and go to the website JWT.io. Here you can put your JWT and it will show you what's inside it. This is your user ID, which is going as a name ID as well as subject. Then this is an email. So these are three claims that you use. This is your expiry, audience, and issuers. Don't worry, even if you can see these details, no one can modify this JWT token because it is signed by secret key. That's why it is secure. Next, let us go to login and check if we will able to log into it. And you can see that login is also successful and we got JWT token. Now implementing the register endpoint, login endpoint, generating token, storing the user, hashing the password is one part of the story. Now we should restrict our API to only authenticated users. Means more specifically, we should not able to call these API endpoints unless we pass JWT token in the request header. Right now, these API endpoints are open to all and anyone can call these API endpoints like this and we can get the result. But we want to restrict it so that only authenticated user should able to call it. So to achieve it, let us go to our API project, and first we will need package Microsoft ASP.NET Authentication .jwt bearer. Let us install this package. In addition to that, we will also need a package system.identity model.tokens.jwt. Let us install this one also. Once this is done, go to your program class, and here we need to add authentication to our service collection. While adding this dependency, we are specifying that our authentication scheme is bearer. Then we have to add some configuration, add JWT bearer, and here we need to set options like this. Once this is added to your service collection, before authorization, we need to add authentication middleware to our pipeline. Always add it before authorization. Once this is done, we want to restrict our entire application so that only authorized user should able to access the endpoints. That means if token exists in request header, then only endpoint will be accessible. For doing that, we can add authorized attribute on our base controller, and as all our controllers will be derived from Orion base controller, automatically this authorized attribute will be applicable to each and every endpoint, and we need not to remember it to put on every action method or every controller. While registering, we are not authorized user or registered user, so that we don't have token. We should able to access them without any tokens. To achieve that, we just need to add allow anonymous attribute to these action methods, which we don't want to restrict for authenticated users. Let us run this application, and now go to Postman. Let us call get stories endpoint, and you will get 401 unauthorized. So to access all these endpoints, now you need to authorize yourself. So let us first go to register, and once you are registered, you will get this token. You can copy this token and then get stories authorization tab. Here you can say bearer token, but instead of doing it for each and every request, what you can do, you can go to this root folder, and on authorization tab, here you can use bearer token, and then you can put your token here. Now if you will see on authorization tab, we are saying inherit auth from parent, so we need not to put that token again and again for each and every request, and still we are getting 401 unauthorized. Let us check why. So it is just we didn't saved this token here. Just press Ctrl S and it will get saved, and then if you will make the request, we should able to hit the endpoint. We got the response successfully. So with this, we successfully implemented authentication and authorization. There are few things left, like when you create the story, we want to save user ID of logged in user who is creating that story. Right now we simply generated dummy GUID, so let us replace it with actual user ID. So let us go to our post endpoint. Here we are creating the story, and here we need to access user ID of logged in user. So that information we can get from token, because on token we have claims, and in that there is a claim subject where we can get the user ID. To access that user ID from token, let us write one helper method. So let us create helper folder. Inside helpers, we will have one interface I user provider. This interface will look like this. It has one method get logged in user ID, and then add the class user provider, which will actually implement this functionality. Implementation of iUser provider will look like this. So HTTP context is an object where we get all the HTTP request information. So over here we are injecting HTTP context accessor. HTTP context accessor has HTTP context where we have user object, and this user object has claims array. From the claims, we want to access the value of name identifier. I think it is okay to use subject also here. name identifier contains our user ID, and that value we are assigning it to user ID variable. If this user ID is null, then we will return empty GUID, and if it is not null, we need to reconvert into GUID and return it. And one important thing is that here we used interface and then we implemented it here. This is important, as while doing unit tests and all, we can provide fake implementation of iUser provider which will not get that user ID from actual HTTP context. So now you can go to stories controller, and here while creating the story on your command object, you can set created by. So you can modify create story command and can add property created by, so that you can set it over here. Here you want to call this get logged in user ID. So we need to inject this class in our stories controller, but we will definitely need this class in every controller wherever we are creating or updating the entities. So instead of injecting it in every controller, we can do that in our base controller. While injecting in base controller, instead of using constructor injector, we use this syntax. We access our dependency using http context.request services.get service. If we will use constructor injection, then in every derived class we need to pass dependency to base constructor. So to avoid that duplicated code everywhere, we generally resolve dependency in base class like this. So as we need to inject user provider class where you are using iUser provider, so we need to define this dependency. Also, if you can see that in user provider we are injecting http context accessor, so we need to define this dependency also. So in program class, before builder.build, you need to add http context accessor to your services, as well dependency for iUser provider. Now with this, we should able to call get logged in user. We have this user provider dot get logged in user ID. One more change that we need to do in create story command handler. Here we are just passing a random GUID. Instead of that, now we have to pass actual user ID, which is in this property created by property. Now let us test our changes. Now if we will go to create story and create some story, let us check if we get proper user ID. So it should get stored to the database. Now one last thing that we need to do is, we are not still saving our users to our database. We are storing it in memory list. To store users to our Cosmos DB, we will need a container for it. So let us create new container user with ID as a partition key. Once this container is created, we can go to appsettings.json and add setting. In Cosmos settings, add user container name, that is user. Next, go to Cosmos repository project, or in Cosmos settings, we will need property to read that setting. So this should be user container. Next, we need to modify this repository to store it to Cosmos DB, but for that purpose we will need Cosmos context. So let us add context interface and class, same as we have iStory Cosmos context interface and story Cosmos context class. Let us add iUser Cosmos context interface. This interface will look like this. Then we have user Cosmos context, and it will look like this. Once these classes are ready, we can modify these methods to store values to database. So now our repository class will look like this. We are injecting Cosmos context, which we use to do all the operations. So in this register, we are creating using create item async method. In get user by email, we are creating query definition object, parameterized SQL query, and we are passing value to this parameter, which we are getting as a parameter to this method. And once this query object is there, we can read data from the database like this. And then get user by ID. One important step, we need to modify this add singleton as add scoped. And we also need to add dependency of user Cosmos context as a singleton. So once this is done, then you can test flow once if you missed something. In stories controller, first you have to get this logged in user, then you go to handler. Over here you need to make sure that to create method you are passing request.createdBy. Here earlier we were passing or dummy GUID, so make sure that you are passing the created by property that you are receiving in your request object now. Let us test it. Let us go to register and create user. User is successfully created. Let us go to Cosmos DB, refresh this, and you can see that user is successfully created in Cosmos DB collection. You can see the hash password here, and now you can test login functionality. It is working fine. Now you can use this token in your header, save it using Ctrl S. Now we want to test create story. Let us make it story 1, and before that I removed all the items in story collection, and let us create this one. Story got created. Let us check in database. So make sure that this ID, user ID, is matching with that the story you created in the created by field. So this created by field should be same as logged in user ID. So with this we have done with authentication and authorization using JWT token in ASP.NET APIs. I will push this code to Azure repo as well to GitHub repo. You can always download and refer it. If you find this content useful, please do like and subscribe. Thank you.